Everybody to the second webinar share on Pirkei Avos on the ethics of our fathers. Just before I begin, I invite everybody to participate in the share either by commenting something or asking questions. I'll stay on for a few minutes afterwards and answer if anybody has any questions. We will start today the first Mishna in Pirkei Avos. And we'll read it inside first and translate it and just explain it on a simple level, and then we'll try to go into a little bit in depth. So the first Mishna in Pirkei Avos says as follows: Moshe kibul Torah miSinai. Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Har Sinai, meaning from Hashem at Har Sinai. Umisara liYeshua, and he passed it over to Yeshua. Yeshua liskenim, and Yeshua passed it over to the elders. Kenim u'neviim, and the elders to the prophets. U'neviim, and the prophets misarua la'amshei knesses hagdola. The prophets gave it over to the amshei knesses hagdola, to the men of the great assembly. So before we go on, just to explain the different expression over here that's used by Moshe Rabbeinu and the rest. It says Moshe received the Torah from Har Sinai, and he gave it over to Yeshua. Why doesn't the Mishnah use the same expression that it should have said Hashem gave the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, and then Moshe gave it, passed it on to Yeshua? Why by Moshe Rabbeinu does it say that he received the Torah from Sinai, from Hashem? And the answer is that when you say that you give over something, that means you've given over everything that you've had. So Moshe Rabbeinu gave over to Yeshua, and Yeshua passed that on to the further generations, everything that he received from Hashem. He didn't leave anything out. However, when you're talking about Hashem to Moshe Rabbeinu, so Hashem gave Moshe Rabbeinu the Torah, but there's so much depth to Torah that a human being cannot understand, because of course Torah is God's wisdom, is Hashem's wisdom, and therefore it's impossible to say that Hashem gave over the entire Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, its entirety, with all of its depth and all the deepest levels. Therefore it says Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah from Hashem, although not everything, and then he gave over everything that he received to the future generations. The Skenim, the elders that are mentioned over here, are the people in Yeshua's generation which outlived him, which lived longer than him, and therefore he gave over the Torah to them. The Amshei Knesses Hagdola primarily was Ezra HaSofer and his court and his Bezdin, who they went up to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, and it lasted all the way till Shimon HaTzadik, like we'll discuss in the second Mishnah. Why before it says to the Amshei Knesses Hagdola, to the men of the great assembly, does it say Misarua again? If you have a look at the Mishnah, it says that he gave it over to Yeshua, and Yeshua to the Skenim to the Neviim, and then it doesn't say the Neviim to the Amshei Knesses Hagdola. It says the Neviim gave it over to the Amshei Knesses Hagdola. Again, that word misarua, given over, to give over. And the answer is because the Amshei Knesses Hagdola were the people after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. And the Neviim were giving it over to that generation. And maybe you would think that after the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, the generation was on such a low level that they lost the Messiah, they lost the tradition. It wasn't given over in its entirety due to the lowliness of that generation. And therefore the Mishnah repeats again the word Misarua, that the prophets gave it over to the Amshei Knesses Hagdola to compare the first Umisara, that Moshe gave it to Yeshua, the entire Torah, so too the prophets gave over the entire Torah to the Amshei Knesses Hagdola, although it was after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Then the Mishnah continues, Hein Omru Shloisha Dvarim. They said three things. Simply speaking, that means that the Amshei Knesses Hagdola said three things. And of course, the pshat over here isn't that they only said three things. They said a lot more than three things. But the three things that they said over here are the foundations of Yiddishkeit, are fundamental principles that will keep the Jewish nation going. And the three things are as follows. Havu misunim badin. Be slow in judgment. Which means when you judge, think it through. The judges are commanded to think it through properly, not just to say the first thing that comes to their head, but actually look into each case specifically and look through it properly and teach the proper law. And the reason why this is so essential to the Jewish nation is because halacha, Jewish law, was decided by the court. The court is where halacha came from. They were the ones who decided what is the halacha. And therefore, in order for the Jewish nation to respect halacha, they have to respect the court which gives over those halachas. And therefore, in order to earn that respect, the judges have to be people which would think through the law, would think through the halacha properly before they actually give it over, to make sure they're giving over the correct law. Then the Mishnah continues, Ve'amidu tamidim harbe. You should establish many students. You should teach Torah to many students. Which means that you shouldn't only teach Torah to students which are worthy, because there is a machlokes, there's an argument between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Are you allowed to teach Torah to a talmid, to a student she'enoi hagun, which is not proper, which is not righteous, because you never know what he'll do with the Torah that you teach him? Beis Shammai says you shouldn't. Beis Hillel says the principle that mitoich shaloi lishma, even if someone learns for the wrong reasons, bal lishma, eventually they'll come to learn for the right reasons. And our Mishnah is siding with Beis Hillel and saying ve'amidul tamidim harbe, have many students, all kinds, even if the students are not worthy, you should still teach them Torah, and eventually they'll learn for the right reasons. And of course, this is essential for the survival of the Jewish nation, because Torah is the key. Learning Torah, limudat Torah, is the key to survival of the Jewish nation. And the last and final thing that's so fundamental is vasus yagla Torah. Make a fence around the Torah, which that's referring to all the takanas chachamim, all the things that a chacham told us to do, even though from the Torah they were mutter, they were permitted, but as a fence to stop us from coming to transgressing a isra from the Torah, they gave us fences, they gave us things which they made more things forbidden, or that we shouldn't stumble, we shouldn't come to transgress an isra from the Torah. Rabbeinu Yoina writes that someone who is machmir, someone who's stringent in the takanas chachamim, in the syagim, in the fences around Torah, shows more yira shamayim, shows more fear of heaven than someone who is machmir in the mitzvahs themselves. Because someone who is machmir in the mitzvahs themselves, yes, he does have yira shamayim, yes, he does have fear of heaven, but he is not necessarily worried that he's going to stumble and make a mistake and do something wrong. Somebody who is machmir in the takanas chachamim, in the chumris that the chacham told us to do to stop us from transgressing an isur from the Torah, means that he's worried even to do an aveira by mistake, and therefore he's tremendously careful in the fences, so he shouldn't come to stumble in the actual aveira. And of course, this idea is essential to the survival of the Jewish nation, because besides for limudat Torah, of course, kiyum mitzvahs, fulfilling Hashem's commandments, is essential for the Jewish people to survive. Why is this Mishnah the beginning of Pirkei Avos? This Mishnah just discusses the way Torah was passed down from generations, starting off from Har Sinai all the way down to the Anshe Knesset Hakdolah. Why is this the beginning? Why is this the foundation of Pirkei Avos, which, as we said last week, primarily, as we said on Monday, primarily discusses midas tovos, how to be a good person, how to be an upright and righteous individual. So the Meiri explains that since this Masechta is not based on any specific mitzvah from the Torah, as we said on Monday, that it's not based on specific psukim of Tanakh or specific commandments from the Torah, therefore you can think that these are just ethics that the Chacham made up themselves. It's not necessarily rooted in tradition. It's not necessarily God-given. Therefore we start off the Masechta saying, Moshe kibul Torah misinai, that everything it says in this Masechta, which is all about ethics, about going beyond the letter of the law, midas tovos, etc., are also given to Moshe Sinai, are also God-given and not man-made. Another pshat is to explain to us why these people that are listed in the Mishnah merited that Torah should be given through them. Moshe Rabbeinu, Yeshua, the Nevi'im, the Zkenim, to tell us it's because they kept everything that it says in Pirkei Avos. Not because they were necessarily the smartest people academically, rather because they had these midas tovos, they had these good midas. For example, as is well known, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the biggest anav in the entire world. He was tremendously humble, and that's why he merited to be the one to transmit Torah. And the same thing goes for all the other sages and the Nevi'im, the Zkenim, and Anshe Knesset Hakdolah, which are listed in this Mishnah. The reason why they merited to be the transmitters of Torah is not because of their intellectual capacity, rather because of their righteousness, because of their anava, of their humble humility, and their midas tovos. The Tiferes Yisrael explains that although we said that derech eretz kodmo la Torah, that And of course, that as a prerequisite to Torah, you have to have derech eretz, you have to have midas tovus, and that's why we learn Pirkei Avos before Shavuos. Although that's true, the other way is also true, that Torah comes before derech eretz, because in order to be a truly moral person, in order to be a truly ethical person, you need to believe in the truth of Torah and that it's God-given. Because if you're just moral and ethical based on what you think is the right thing to do, so if you're convinced otherwise, or somehow you explain to yourself how you shouldn't be moral in this case, you'll go and do that. Therefore, as an introduction to Pirkei Avos, an introduction to being an ethical person with midas tovus, with good midas, you first need to know that Moshe kibul Torah miSinai. The reason why we're being moral, the reason why we're keeping these ethics is because they were given to us by God at Mount Sinai to Moshe Rabbeinu. Further on in the Mishna, we said, Heim Omru Shloisha Dvarim. They said three things. Who are the they? So simply speaking, they are the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. They said three things. However, on a deeper level, we can say that that these three things were each said by, the first one was said by Yehoshua to the Zkenim, the second one was said by the Zkenim to the Nevi'im, and the third one was said from the Nevi'im to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. And they were each said as a relevant command to that generation. Yehoshua told the Nevi'im, Havim usunim badin, come up and think through before you say a judgment. The reason is because it says that the day that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away, 3,000 halachas were forgotten. And since somewhat of tradition was forgotten, Yehoshua told the sages after him, be careful when you judge a halacha to get it right and to make sure to rediscover what the tradition was, what the halacha was. These Canaan saw that Nevuah was dwindling. The amount of Nevi'im that were in the later generations were much less than were in the first generations. And therefore they said, Va'amidu tamidim harbe, have a lot of students, because maybe one of them or a few of them will merit to Nevuah, they will merit to this amazing thing of prophecy. And the Nevi'im told the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, they saw that the Jewish people are going into Golos, they saw that they're going into exile, and they saw that the Jewish people are going to be all spread out, and they were worried maybe the Torah will be forgotten. They said, "Vasus yagla Torah, make a fence around Torah. Be careful, make sure to keep Torah and to preserve Torah and to preserve the mitzvahs by making fences around it and being very strict in the Takanas Chacham." In the first thing that was said, "Havu mesunim badin," be careful in judgment. Most of the Mefarshim explain that it's actually talking about dinei mominus, monetary things, and not isur veheter, not about what's asur and what's mutter. Why is it that way? Why is having mesunim madin more important in dinei mominus than isur veheter? Why does the Mishnah find it necessary to say it about that specifically? The Tiferes Yisrael explains, because when it comes to dinei mominus, when it comes to monetary disputes, there is no such thing as being mekel, as being less strict. Because if I'm less strict for one person, that means I'm being strict on the other person. If I say that Ruvain owes, if you say that Ruvain does not owe Shimon money, so I'm being mekel, I'm being less strict with Ruvain, but I'm being more strict with Shimon because he might be losing out on money that rightfully belongs to him. Therefore, you have to be very careful when it comes to dinei mominus with monetary things to think through what you're going to say. Another explanation is a little bit different. That in dinei mominus, when it comes to isur veheter, when it comes to things which are asur and mutter, it's actually very obvious that you have to be careful. Because if someone paskins that a certain pot is kosher and a person goes and eats from it, it's too late. You can never go back. But when it comes to dinei mominus, when it comes to monetary disputes, so the court can think, I don't have to think it through so carefully, because if I'm wrong, I'll look through it again and I'll tell them, okay, let's do it again. Let's give the money to somebody else. And therefore, the Mishnah says, even when it comes to such things, have a musunim madin, be careful, think it through carefully, even though you will have a chance to go back. Have a great day.